is extraordinarily aggressive. Recent data reveal that 1/3 of the black male population in the United Kingdom have profiles on the national database. This is extraordinary. And the reason, of course, is that anybody arrested in the UK or picked up or stopped can be swabbed for their DNA and put on the national database. So you just walk out of line, you're at a political rally and you raise your hands and you're arrested, that's it. You're now on the UK data bank. So the questions I raised for this talk are: minorities overrepresented on CODIS, on the national? What are the implications on minority populations of opening up CODIS to arrestees who have not been convicted of any crimes? Now, some states are doing it, but certainly not across the country yet. If minorities are overrepresented on CODIS, what are the consequences? Maybe none, maybe some. It has to be explored. First of all, if arrestees are entered onto CODIS and there is disproportionately more minority arrests as there are in drug possession, then minorities will be disproportionately represented. So that's one way that this will happen. If minorities in prison are DNA profiled and entered into CODIS, then since they are disproportionately represented in prison, they will be disproportionately represented in CODIS. So already you have a system with 40% of the incarcerated people are minorities. If they're all profiled, then the entire CODIS system will reflect the same disproportionality in the prison system. Of course, somebody might argue, well, they're in prison. They should have their profiles in CODIS. And after all, who cares about prisoners? They don't have any rights to have their privacy protected. So that's certainly another issue. But on the other hand, we're looking at a movement that puts people on the database who are not convicted of a crime. They might just be picked up. Several of us were talking about the Skip Gates incident. Massachusetts isn't one of the places, but if it were, he would have been swabbed right away. And then, his DNA would have been on CODIS. If mistakes in DNA profiling leading to false convictions affect minorities disproportionately, then minorities will be disproportionately represented on CODIS. It turns out that the Houston laboratories had enormous scientific misconduct going on and put people into prison, and minorities were disproportionately incarcerated because of violations in laboratory practice in Houston, and we're still paying the price for those misconducts. Undocumented immigrants, primarily minority populations, when stopped, have their DNA taken. This is part of a new law. This adds to the representation of these groups on CODIS. So not that they committed a crime, they just stopped, checked out. They can get their DNA taken on CODIS as well. So these are the ways that you can actually get disproportionate minority representation on CODIS, these different systems. So if DNA dragnets are taken disproportionately from minority populations, then it will add to the social disparity on the National Forensic DNA Data Bank. That's another way that these disparities can happen. And in dragnets, when they go to communities and they say, look, we need to exclude you as a possible suspect, give us your DNA. So people typically say, oh, sure, I'll give you my DNA. I didn't commit the crime. Then their DNA gets put into the local database, and then it gets put onto the national database. And then these people say, wait a minute, I gave you my DNA to exclude me. I didn't give it to you so that I'm going to be forever on the DNA databank. And now that's being litigated in a couple of states, and in Massachusetts, where there was a DNA dragnet on Cape Cod, and a whole group of people had their DNA put on the data bank, and now it's being litigated in Massachusetts as to whether or not they can get their DNA off the data bank. So the DNA Fingerprint Act of 2005, signed in law January 2006, authorized DNA collection and retention from persons arrested or non-U.S. persons detained under federal authority. It gives the Attorney General enormous powers to add people's DNA on the DNA data bank. And in the last few years, the enthusiasm for DNA data banking has prompted some state legislatures to expand their data banks beyond convicted offenders to arrestees, even if not convicted of a crime. So Virginia, Texas, Louisiana, California, New Mexico, Minnesota, Kansas, and Tennessee have approved legislation to allow DNA testing of some categories of arrested individuals. So if that expands throughout the country, we will then begin to see a data bank comprised significantly of people who've never been arrested, don't have a prison record, but have their DNA on a data bank which may appear to some that they have a prison record. So the cycle of racial ethnic disparity in DNA data banks would look something like the following. Arrests are targeted disproportionately to minorities, if that's in fact the case, which has been shown in certain areas of criminal justice. DNA profiles of arrestees are put on CODIS, and therefore there'll be a racial disparity of DNA profiles on CODIS. So the big question is, what are the consequences for minorities of being overrepresented on CODIS? What's the big deal? I mean, let's suppose somebody says, so I'm on CODIS. I don't commit crimes. You know, what's the big deal? All it means is, if they find some DNA at a crime scene and they put it into CODIS, they're not going to get me on it because it's not going to be a match. Well, there are 4 ways that people can be involved, implicated, even if they have not committed any crimes. And I'm going to summarize them. One is called familial searches. The other is called molecular photofitting of DNA. The third I call the usual suspects. And fourth has to do with research on race, ancestry, and crime. These are four ways that people who have never committed a crime can get involved in the criminal justice system. Well, first, familial searches. So when police can't find a cold hit, they find a sample of DNA at a crime scene. Typically, they would have the DNA profiled with the 26 numbers. They'd submit it to CODIS. If they're lucky, they'll get a cold hit, an exact match, but sometimes they don't. So they may recalibrate the search criteria to find close matches, called familial searches. These close matches may contain several hundred individuals. Some innocent people may meet the search criteria, and they may be investigated as potential family members of the crime suspect. So if you happen to be on the database and you happen to be what is considered to be a close match, you'll be contacted by police, and they'll say, we want information about your family because we think that the person who left their DNA at the crime scene may be a family member of yours because the match was too close for you. Now, that person who meets the criteria of the close match may be somebody who's in prison, may be somebody who has never been convicted of a crime. They may be somebody who gave their DNA in a dragnet to be excluded, but there's their DNA on the CODIS DNA database, and now this knocks on their door, and they're saying, we want information about your family because you came out as a close match. Anyone with a DNA profile on CODIS, even people who gave their DNA voluntarily, as I said, are potentially subjects, their family, to DNA surveillance. If minorities are disproportionately represented on CODIS, then they and their families will be at a higher risk for DNA surveillance. It's very simple, logical inference. Okay. So, molecular photo fitting. This is a method that's been proposed of turning a DNA sample into a set of physical characteristics of the person who is believed to have left his or her DNA at a crime scene. I mean, it's the idea of finding some DNA and out of the DNA constructing a physical picture of the individual somehow, piece by piece, hair color, eye color, bone structure. You know, there are actually experiments going on today in which people are using those old 19th century techniques of measuring head size and structures and trying to correlate them with DNA so that when they get the DNA, they can then do the reverse correlation and say, this DNA must come from a person who has this head structure and these cheekbones, etc. Companies that do this kind of work claim they can correlate certain DNA sequences with hair color, ancestry, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, from my own experience, if you're going to commit a crime and you have red hair, you've got a much better chance of being caught as a person who has red hair. I mean, because red hair is probably one of the better correlational features of DNA than almost any other physical characteristic for some reason. Maybe some people in the audience will have some insights into this. So there's a product called DNA Witness that's been marketed to police, which claims to be able to infer skin color, melanin index from DNA. And to use this method, the police need more than the 13 loci. They need more than the 26 numbers, because those 26 numbers tell us nothing about the physical characteristics of the individual. They were chosen specifically because they don't correlate with any physical characteristics of the individual. So that means that the police have to go back to the original biological sample to get more information about the individual, which is why a lot of police departments do not want to give up the original biological sample, because there's more information that they can get. Because the composition of the National Forensic DNA Database is so heavily African American, possibly up to 40%, the traits common to this group will be sought out in developing profiles of suspects. While race has no scientific significance, as we've heard, it is a good bet that it will be the basis of molecular photo fitting, because there's so many people of the minority community represented on the DNA databanks to begin with. And of course, this molecular photo fitting is highly speculative, has enormous amounts of assumptions, and has never, ever met the standards of validity that would be required of any scientific technology that's used. The fourth, usual suspects. Suppose there's been a robbery at a Starbucks and the employee believes that he had served the hooded suspect coffee before the robbery. Police pick up all the used cups and have them profiled. All the people who have a DNA profile on CODIS will be the first contacted and placed under surveillance. So,